No, no, not yet.
Nearly.
Can people see it?
Yeah.
Not just yet, Neil. Ah, yeah. There you go.
Ah, right.
Is that there?
Yep.
So everybody can see the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, and everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Right, okay, I'll start then. Things have changed since I last was involved in a webinar. I think previously nobody could actually see what I look like. Now you can, everybody can, and most disconcertingly, so can I. Right, well the aim of the webinar is really to introduce a research method that I think has a potential to offer insights into longer term impact of widening participation or widening access interventions. I think it's also got the potential to indicate the relative significance of these interventions as well. Okay, so see if I can move my slides along. For some reason it's, why isn't it? I'm having problems. Here we go. Right. Okay. So, well, to this end, I want to really just use the structure that you see before you. So I'll start with a little background on evaluation of widening participation, WP activity, and the importance that's now attached to evaluation by the regulators. Before introducing the concept of the live story interview. I'll then talk very briefly about the pilot study we set up to test the potential of this method, along with some of the initial findings. The description of the webinar emphasises that it's going to be a discussion-based event. So to facilitate that, I thought it might be useful and potentially quite informative to frame our discussion of the value of this methodology around the SWOT analysis. Now the description talks about exploring the methodology's strengths and limitations. I think it would also be quite useful to think in terms of opportunities and threats to its to the methodology's wider application. Now, in the final part of the paper, I also want to attempt to draw things together from the SWOT analysis, and I also hope in this final section to discuss some of the additional findings that this pilot study's drawn out in terms of effective practice that interviewers can adopt to really enhance the quality of the data that's being generated. Okay, so that's the plan. If we start then with just a bit about background, considerable importance is now placed on the evaluation of widening participation interventions. It's very evident if you read any of the offer's recent guidance, including their national strategy, but also the monitoring returns and guidance on access agreements. Considerable attention in all of these publications is given to the value of evaluation. Right, sorry, you can only see this on my head. Is that any better? Yeah, okay. But what you also will notice, if you read some of this guidance, is the particular focus on the long-term evaluation. And the rationale for this is really around the fact that it's only long-term evaluation that can reveal what happens as a result of participating in programs, on interventions. And that really explains the regulators, policymakers' focus on this aspect of evaluation. However, what's also clear, and it's something I've certainly been aware of since my time with Damon Hire, is that there's a challenge associated with this, and that's in identifying research methods that are able to cast light on the longer term impact. We're generally better, and we have been for some time, at reporting the more immediate short-term effects. That's through, for example, end-of-event questionnaires, which are widely used across the sector. So it's against this backdrop that one method was tested, one method that appears to have the potential for providing a longer-term perspective on outreach interventions, and that's the life story interview. Now this is a qualitative methodology, so it's about generating rich narrative data. Generally, life story interviews are used in a semi-structured format. So there'll be a set of predetermined questions around which supplementary questions can be posed in response to the replies given during the interview by the interviewee. As the name suggests, life story interview is about the interviewee telling us their life story. Now theoretically, that could be enormous, but its potential in relation to assessing the impact of widening participation interventions lies in the fact that this approach has been used to investigate specific social and cultural issues and themes that impact upon lives. And it's also perhaps worth noting a distinction here between life story interviews and oral history. Oral history tends to focus on a particular event or episode in somebody's life, and is in a way more concerned with identifying facts. Life story interviews, by contrast, bring the story up to the present, and the focus is on impressions, on reflections. And that's a crude distinction, but it's one that is made in the literature. It's also argued, in kind of favouring life story interviews, is that they do provide a chance to hear life stories of individuals from underrepresented groups, and obviously that fits perfectly with widening participation. So given this potential, I decided to test how useful a life story interview might be as a method of evaluating the longer term impact of WP interventions. For this, use was made of a pilot study. Now, pilot studies are recognised as being a good mechanism for exploring, for testing research instruments and research protocols. The pilot study used for this, in this case, was based on life story interviews from 3 undergraduates studying at Loughborough. Now, these were volunteers. Now, the sample's small, but it's consistent in terms of size with similar qualitative studies. All 3, it should be added, all 3 interviewees met various widening participation criteria, including coming from neighbourhoods with low rates of HE participation. So that's polar data. But also, all of them participated in outreach activities whilst at school. Interviews were conducted by myself during October of last year. And the data used to assess the interviews came from 3 primary sources. The first was a research journal I kept throughout the pilot study. Now this recorded procedures for recruiting interviewees, as well as background information around setting up the interviews. The journal, however, also included my reflections on the interview process itself. So, and this was completed after each interview. And these reflections explored what had gone well in facilitating engagement and data generation and the reasons behind this. Consideration was also given to what had not gone so well in interviews, and why, along with kind of ideas for improvements and actions that could be taken to implement these improvements. So it's kind of an iterative process in a way over the course of the 3 interviews, just refining the practices and approaches. The second source used were the transcripts from the interviews. And the third source was really feedback received from interviewees in their replies to a follow-up email I sent after each interview. And the primary purpose of this email was actually just to thank them for their time and the insights the kind of interviews had offered. However, it also proved an opportunity to ask them any further thoughts and reflections on their experience. Okay, so in terms of initial findings, well, these were positive. Each interview lasted between 60 and 90 minutes. And they also provided a kind of wealth of information, a lot of detail as well. Transcripts range from 8,000 words to just under 12,000 words in length. Now, the initial impressions logged in the research journal identified that the methodology was able to capture insights into each interviewee's learner journey, their educational experiences and influences going back to early childhood, and including accounts of the outreach and recruitment activities they'd experienced during that journey as well. In addition, positive feedback was received from each of the interviewees themselves. Now this included positive comments about the experience leading to their own self-discovery in a way. And I've got the first 2 quotes relate to those. There's this kind of realization that there are a range of influences on them, and kind of the opportunity it gave to getting them to think about what motivates them. Feedback from the interviews was also very positive in terms of the kind of the nature of the interview itself, how it was conducted, and here we have kind of the third quote on this slide talks about that, and the fact that they were allowed to, they directed the flow of the conversation and the kind of topics that were raised. Okay, so that's a bit of background, that's a bit of an overview of the method, the pilot study, and the initial findings. I've done quite a bit of talking already, I think, so the idea now is really to kind of open things up for a bit of discussion, if that's okay with the chair. And I thought a fruitful way to do this, to frame it, is in this kind of SWOT analysis. Now, the reading I've done around SWOT suggests that it is suitable for testing of concepts. To be effective, of course, SWOT analysis, you need to have a clear objective. And the objective here is really to assess life story interview as a method for evaluating longer-term impact of WTP interventions. And just as a kind of reminder, what we're looking for is consideration of the method's strengths and advantages along with its weaknesses compared with other evaluation methods. As mentioned earlier, SWOT also considers the external environment, so we're looking also at opportunities and the threats posed to the wider adoption and application of the method. So I guess it's probably worth starting with looking at the strengths and advantages to this, given what I've said and also given everybody's knowledge already of the approach. So I don't know if that's the way we can start the discussion. And what I'll try and do, I have a pen and some paper, so I will try and jot down what people say. And if it's not included in, I have another slide in the kind of slide I've already prepared for what I consider to be some strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Then I'll add it to this slide, and we can circulate it in a more complete format. Does that sound okay?
That sounds fine, Neil. And anybody who doesn't have a mic on their computer, just put things in the chat box and I'll draw Neil's attention to it.
Thank you.
Don't forget to unmute if you'd like to say anything.
Oh, sorry, there is a, how old were the participants? Yeah, they were all undergraduates, so they kind of came through a traditional route of A-levels, so they would have, and they were all in their kind of second year, so they're in their very early 20s. Which was quite interesting because a lot of studies on WP students actually opt for looking at matures, looking at those who have gone taken a non-traditional route. But these are kind of the minority really. So we certainly at institutions like Loughborough, so the incentive was to look at the experiences of those that make up the majority of our WP students. Yeah, that's right. They were current students.
Neil, for me, it would be easier to assess the strengths and weaknesses if you could give some examples of the kinds of things.
Okay. Yes, I can do that.
I know you give some about what they thought of doing it, but if you could give any more examples of the kind of things they raised.
Oh, in terms of the actual findings from the study? I mean, what I can, yeah, okay, what I can, I mean, just very briefly, I mean, what we did discover through the interviews was that the kind of range of influences on them. Now, whilst one particularly noticeable trend was the impact, the very positive impact of family and parents. Now, these parents hadn't gone to, in none of the cases had parents gone to HE, but they certainly valued education, and and that manifested itself in, for example, ensuring that and encouraging these young people to do their homework, making sure there's a space for them to do their homework, and ferrying them around as well on occasions to kind of university open days and so forth. So that was one. Another one was the kind of the influence of one or two key teachers who recognised their potential and encouraged them to work and get involved in clubs and societies at schools, in their schools. Okay, what I can do, just to give you some kind of some indication, and I'm getting some weaknesses and strengths through, which are great. I can tell you the kind of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats that I kind of thought about. Shall I do that?
Yeah. Have people noted the John? I imagine that first comment from you was a weakness, and the second is a strength. Yeah. Okay. And another weakness. Right. Yeah. Do that, Neil. Then.
Okay. Right. There we go. So, and I'm quite happy just to talk you through these, if that would be helpful. Okay, so first of all, one of the strengths was the ability of and this is what we found, ability of the interviews to generate rich qualitative data, real insights, and to actually, the opportunity to ask supplementary questions was also very powerful there in drawing out additional information. I think what I also noticed was that data generated can place the role of outreach interventions into the wider context of other influences on these young people, positive, negative influences, which is quite interesting, and it's something that a lot of other methods aren't able to do. We kind of place it in a wider context. I guess another one is a kind of a, and I mentioned this, the kind of the self-discovery involved in the process for the interviewees. They kind of discovered what motivated them, which was actually quite significant. As I said, they were all volunteers to be interviewed, but they were all training to become student mentors. And the opportunity to reflect and think about their own kind of routeways, own trajectories, was considered quite powerful and useful in terms of kind of, how they might mentor and guide others. And there's also kind of a CPD aspect to this, I think, in terms of the staff involved in undertaking these interviews. I mean, it gives them first-hand experience, first-hand insights into kind of the learner experience. Yeah, I mean, I've got a question here about how did we start the interviews off, and it was really just that Potter emphasised the importance of kind of explaining why they've been selected, what it was all about. And we did this. We did say that this is we're interested in understanding better your kind of experiences of getting here, getting to university. But we also stated that we're using a new method, and we'll be interested in your feedback on that. The first questions, I mean, with a lot of interviews, they're kind of warm-up questions. So you just try to put them at their ease, trying to build up rapport and trust with them. And initial questions were fairly straightforward, easy ones to answer. So about their course, about the year of study, and then we started getting into conversations about their kind of their history, how they got here. And that was done really through suggesting that they might want to think about phases in their kind of educational careers, starting with very early years, moving into primary school, secondary school, which we broke down into pre and post 16. So it was like that, and then it just allowed them to kind of talk, and questions would arise in response to what they were saying. Okay, right, we've got some weaknesses here, which I've taken note of, and I've also identified some weaknesses myself. Yeah, the quality of the data is really very dependent upon the skills of the interviewer to draw out and to kind of engage with the interviewee. I'll say a bit more about that, because from the pilot study, we did identify some useful devices and tactics interviewers could use in kind of enhancing the quality of the data being generated. It's also dependent upon memory and recall, and the ability of the interviewee to kind of remember certain things. It's also, there's just one perspective we've got with this at a set point in time. So the perspective is that of the, in this case, the undergraduate at a set point of time, which is in their first or second year. So they're looking back. So it's kind of retrospective. And they might post-rationalise things as well, so there's that danger. There's also the challenge, I guess, of cross-case comparisons. If the interview's allowed to kind of freely develop, how we're going to get a lot of material, how do we compare one interviewee with another? And then there's a question of how representative are these interviewees, given that they're volunteers, and one might imagine the vocal, more confident are likely to volunteer. Okay, if we move on to some of the opportunities and threats, and the opportunities and threats are kind of sort of looking ahead. Now I suppose one opportunity is the fact that offer, as I've kind of say at the start of the talk, Office of Fair Access is very interested in assessing the long-term impact of outreach interventions. Although they also recognise the challenge in terms of identifying suitable research methods. So consequently, monitoring the last set of monitoring returns said or asked the sector to volunteer examples of practices that are able, methods that are able to cast light on the long term. What's also evident from access agreements and the kind of guidance is the interest in hearing the learner voice, recognising the importance of the learner voice, and this obviously methodology has a potential to take advantage of that opportunity. There's also a lot of talk, increasing talk about the importance of long-range outreach, so going back to primary schools. So again, that's an opportunity potentially for this methodology. And finally, there's a lot of talk and kind of lots of assumptions in various guidance documentation that it will be the practitioner who will act as the evaluator. In this case, it will be the practitioner who leads the interviews. Now, there are pros and cons to that. One potential advantage with this approach, with the practitioner researcher approach, is that they'll have ready access to some key witnesses, the undergraduates. From my pilot study, there's also the advantage, the logistical advantage. It's easy to get, believe it or not, after my kind of challenges today, rooms that are quiet, moderately quiet, and conveniently located and at a convenient time as well. Moving then to kind of the threats. Well, is how do you disseminate? How do you inform the sector more widely about new research methods? That was easier, potentially, I guess, in the days of AIM Higher when there were structures in place. There's also what we might call a new orthodoxy, led by one or two academics, Gora being one, which is kind of places a lot of tension on quantitative methods as the only kind of reliable way of assessing. And then there are also cost implications in terms of staff time, in terms of time to organise, conduct these interviews. And then there are technical challenges in implementing that, which goes back to the interviewer's skills. And also challenge around analysing and reporting on the findings. You know, it does take, there's time and effort involved in kind of analysis of interview transcripts and making sense of the findings and reporting them in a kind of accessible way. So I think they're the kind of key strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats I've encountered. I don't know if anybody's got any comments additional to what I've seen being typed. Yeah,
Neil, can you, are there any requirements from OFFA on some quantitative data in terms of evaluation?
Not really. They do recognise the value of mixed methods approaches. And
that's something.
Yeah, and some initial discussions with them suggest that they are actually quite interested in this and they'd like to know a bit more. So I think the door's ajar on that.
That's actually.
I mean, the advantage of I mean, quantitative is good, but you're not getting potentially at the why and how. Why, you know, if you can identify the fact that an intervention, if you've got a large enough sample and so forth, this is something we are working on, and you can start to correlate individuals' participation in interventions with their subsequent progression. You can do that, but what you can't do so easily from the quantitative is find out the reasons why. Why did these interventions have this impact? What was it about them that seemed to have a real consequence in subsequent people's trajectory?
Yeah, I don't need convincing. I'm just interested in what the attitude of offer was to this. So it's actually quite reassuring to know that they actually appreciated the value of qualitative data.
Yes, it seems to be. I mean, time will tell ultimately, because my plan is to just, they've spoken very positively and encouragingly about qualitative analysis and the use of life story interviews. My intention is really just to drop them a summary, including some of the key findings from this pilot, and just to see where that leads. Okay, what I could do, Janet, now is just the next stage of the kind of SWOT analysis is really to counter the weaknesses, to see if there are ways in which we can get round some of the key weaknesses I've identified. And I'd be happy to do that, which really means talking through some of the later findings from the pilot.
Yep, okay, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I'm not going to go through all five, but what I will do is just concentrate on the top three, which seem to me I've attempted to rank them, whether rightly or wrongly, from 1 to 5. So, given pressures of time and so forth, I thought I'd just focus on those three, which seem to be the major ones. Okay, so. In terms of the first weakness, now this is around data quality being dependent very much upon the skill of the interviewer. In qualitative research, the interviewer or the researcher is often the research instrument, so it's highly dependent upon them, and there's a possibility as a consequence that you're going to get variations in what is generated as a result of different practices being adopted by interviewers. Now, countering that, the pilot study was able to identify a range of practices that could be adopted by interviewers to engage interviewees and to really facilitate detailed insights, what we might describe as practices that encourage reflection. So these included simply allowing time for interviewees to think, so it's the use of silence, and to recognise when they might be reflecting and thinking things through. I'll mention, Alison Fuller in a little while as well, thank you. Thinking things through. So it's active listening and being really focused on the interview and interviewee. Another post which was noted in the research journal, and which is also discussed in the literature, is to encourage interviewees to reflect on certain remarks they might make during the course of the interview. Now, Harold and Bradley talk about or suggest repeating a keyword or phrase used by the interviewer, which can potentially trigger reflection. And that this device was actually deployed on a number of occasions in the pilot study, and it did initiate reflection on the part of the interviewee, and did lead to, in a number of cases, quite a lot more elaboration. And on a similar theme, another practice that I found quite successful was asking respondents to explain what they meant by a particular phrase, and that proved to be a very effective tactic. Now, I've got an example. I think it was a second or third interview. The interviewee brought up the idea, or raised the idea, that they had been brought up in a sheltered environment. And the response really was, well, what do you mean by sheltered environment? And that prompted a lot of really quite a detailed and insightful reply about the involvement of parents, family, peers, the kind of culture that they grew up in. So, taking note of and working on key phrases was also quite important there. Also, I suppose what one might call quality checks that can be done. Now again, if you look at the literature, talks about the importance of internal consistency as a measure of data validity. So what is said in one part of the narrative of the interview does not contradict what's said at a later point in the interview. Now, the research journal that I kept noted the ability to check and test quality as the interviews were progressing was really linked to the ability of the interviewer and that need to really listen carefully to what is being said, and also ability to recall what was said earlier in the conversation. So it's about really kind of entering your mind almost and really focusing on the interview. Also observed from the notes was practice of summarising. This was done quite regularly, I guess, summarising a phase of a discussion and then asking questions of the interviewee around the accuracy or otherwise of the summary given. The things that they will want to add, the things that they want to qualify from the summary offered. Another validity check adopted in the pilot was the practice of checking consistency between what was being said or what was being heard and what was being seen in terms of the body language of the interviewee. Now that's the interviewer's perception of what they're seeing, so that practice needs to be accompanied by commenting effectively on what they're seeing and seeking confirmation or correction. And again, that seemed to work. If it's done carefully, it seemed to work very well on a number of occasions. Beyond that, I mean, it's kind of quality can also be influenced by, as I guess my room swapping has illustrated today, by an appropriate interview setting and timing. And the literature talks about the importance of a quiet location, convenient location, suitable time for the interviewee, and that's one of the advantages potentially of kind of practitioner doing research. What feedback also, and I've got some feedback from the interviewees around this subject, and what was quite interesting was that amongst them was the observation that actually it would have been nice to have a more relaxed environment. And thinking through what was meant by that was that the interviews were conducted in fairly formal office type arrangement comprising upright chairs and a desk, which could act, I guess, as a potential barrier. So it's kind of worth thinking about the geography, the setup, the ambience of the interview room as well. Right, moving on to issues of memory and the ability of recall being quite important, and it can impact on the quality of data generated. Now, a number of, if you read through the literature again, there is a general suggestion that memories associated in childhood, adolescence, early adulthood may be more easily recalled than those of middle and later years. So when you're looking at wider participation, particularly amongst the kind of younger, more bulk of students who come through, then life story interviews may well be fine because we're looking at these kind of early influences. There's also an argument that if the event and situation was significant in somebody's history, then it's likely to be remembered in some detail. Now, evidence from the pilot study did indicate on whole that participants were able to recall in some detail key aspects of their learner journeys. It was also found that the interaction between the interviewer and interviewee, because these are kind of co-constructed narratives, that interaction, the process of asking questions, of allowing time for the interviewee to reflect, also helps in the recall process. Right, turning, I guess, to the third potential weakness, which can be divided into the fact that it's a single perspective is being offered, and then at a particular point in time. And this really, I mean, it is a limitation of the methodology, but it's also reflected in the research design, and one can imagine, one can think through ways in which the design of the research could be tweaked to counter each of these. So if we first of all look at the one perspective issue, and we can think of modifying the design there. Now, Farrell, amongst others, has suggested conducting a series of these interviews with the same individuals over a period of time, and this would enable changes to be measured and explored in a more, I suppose, contemporaneous manner. It's also argued that that approach, series of interviews, is also more likely to avoid the potential for respondents to imbue their actions with a kind of rationality that didn't exist at the time, and that's something I kind of mentioned a little while back. However, there are disadvantages to such an approach: time, budget. There's also ongoing commitment required from the researchers and participants, and it may well take time for these results to emerge. But then there's I mean, we're all asked to produce access and agreements, talking through our evaluations and processes leading up to, at the moment, it's 2017-18. So there is that time, the time is there if the kind of inclination is as well. Turning to countering the single perspective limitation. One strategy is for interviewing those identified as key influencers by interviewees, and that's somebody mentioned Alison Fuller, who's done something similar. So it's not just interviewing the young people; it's interviewing those who consider to have a big influence on their potential progression, and that's kind of, I suppose you could describe that as kind of snowball sampling as well, and it's opportunity, and it's also got the advantage of triangulation, so you can check. That is another mechanism of checking the reliability of the data. I suppose another link to this perspective issue, and one that I'm sure Stephen Gorard, amongst others, would raise, is the issue of comparator groups. For this part of the study, because the main concern was in testing and methodology, we just looked at those who had actually got here. But what about those who didn't? They're kind of their comparators. But it's possible to envisage a way of using this methodology in a different design to do that. So we could go back and look at those who were in the process or had applied to HE and those who had not. And I think in that way we could start to identify differences in the learner journey experience, including the impact of NEWP interventions. Okay, right. I'm aware of the time. So shall I draw things to a conclusion, Janet? Okay.
Sorry, just plugging in a power source.
Right. Well, I'll draw things to a conclusion, and then if anybody would like to ask further questions, then I'm very happy to answer them. It's quite a challenge actually, kind of thinking what you're going to say and then reading notes as well. So some of these notes I probably haven't applied to, but they're very useful, and I can enhance the little grid, the SWOT grid, with further feedback. Okay, well, just to conclude then, I think life history or life story interview should be recognised as an instrument that's capable of offering insights into longer term impact about work. So it's important to recognise their limitations and to work with research design as well, which can overcome some of the weaknesses we've identified. equally, they have a wider potential, which I didn't really recognise until I started on the pilot. And that wider potential, which should be acknowledged, is being able and capable of identifying a range of other influences impacting on an individual educational progression. And I think that's important for two reasons. First of all, it helps to place outreach interventions in a wider context. And I mean, it is a kind of sobering consequence, sobering effect of the interviews I conducted. But actually, there are a lot of other influences, greater influences than the kind of WP interventions these young people have been on. But it also raises the potential of developing more sophisticated and sensitive and tailored interventions around the kind of experiences of the individual. So we're not doing one impartification to them, we're engaging with them. Can people hear me? I'm going to carry on. I'm in
Yes.
phone now. So I guess we can conclude by thinking in terms of opportunities and threats as well. Now this is a new, generally underused research method, certainly in terms of widening participation, access and so forth. And there is a threat around dissemination and raising awareness of this methodology. However, countering that is the fact that, as indicated, offer are quite keen for the sector to offer examples of practice that seems to work, including, and this is what emerged from the latest monitoring returns, including reporting on research methods that seem to offer insights into the longer term. One hopes that includes qualitative research methods as well. And I guess I'd also just like to thank Rob, Kath, Janet, CRA, and everybody who's been listening, because that's another way, this webinar, I guess, is another way of providing an opportunity to talk and explore this approach. So thank you.
Thank you, Neil. There was a question from Annika about whether you were thinking of presenting this as a conference paper at some point.
Well, I'd like to. Yes, it's quite possible. I'd also like to write up some of the findings as well. But yes, I guess this has been a potential rehearsal for that. So yes.
Well, that's good. And of course, the new CRA journal is always a potential place to place some research like this.
Thank you, Janet. Yes, hopefully I'll take up that opportunity.
But you haven't got a particular conference in mind at the moment, Annika is asking. Not really. It's an interesting, timing is an interesting question. I mean, there is I've got quite a lot on at the moment, but there is an opportunity, I suppose, to allowing time to, there's a FACE conference coming up, which I kind of go to on a, and that's one of the themes there is learner journeys, so there might be an opportunity to do that. But to be honest, I've got two hats on, and I'm not sure I should admit that now, given what I've been saying, but the other thing we're trying to do is to do some quantitative analysis and to link two big data sets, so a data set of outreach participants to a data set on university applicants. Now that might seem really straightforward, but actually there are no students currently don't have a unique identifier number. So it's a process of what we kind of refer to as fuzzy matching. And every time that's mentioned, people laugh. But the idea is that we actually can identify common links between those individuals in each of those sets and start to build that see their kind of pathways into HE. That's a quantitative.
it does sit actually quite comfortably with the kind of life story interviews, because we're not going to find out, even if we can establish a link between an intervention and subsequent progression, we don't know how or why, and that's where these kind of interviews come in.
Yeah. I think there's a number of people in the webinar who are hoping to keep in touch with you, Neil, and maybe continue the conversation. And you have that, well, thank you, you've put your contact details there, but you've got their contact details in the chat in the webinar.
Yes.
So thank you very much for that.
Keep in contact.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much.
And thank you everybody for participating, attending, and as Neil says, do get in touch with him if you'd like to take the conversation further.
Please. Thank you very much, Janet.